Hello, everyone. This is going to be 25.1, the 60s. This is going to be part one of two, and we've already covered a lot of this in the civil rights presentations that you all did in class as well. So we will have thoroughly covered the 60s by the time we're done with this. We're going to start with two primary sources. The first one from John F. Kennedy when he accepted the nomination for the presidency of the Democratic Party, and he said, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and unfilled threats." A few years later, Lyndon Johnson, the new president of the United States, said in his Great Society speech, "The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we are totally committed in our time." So let's take a look first at the Kennedy years. John F. Kennedy only had 3 years in the White House, and a lot of his stuff is sort of like he's remembered as a really great president, and he had the capacity to be one, but he didn't really have the time, unfortunately, due to his assassination. A lot of his domestic stuff never got off the ground, as we're going to see. Much of what he wanted to do with civil rights actually gets done by Johnson a few years later on, the Civil Rights Act and things like that. Now, Kennedy's image has also been somewhat tarnished after his death, sex scandals and things of that nature. However, during his time period in office, he was very popular. He was young. He was idealistic. People called this time period of his time in office Camelot, because it seemed that he was bringing sort of this Arthurian legend to life in this. Now, his biggest victories and failures were mostly abroad. That's where he spent most of his time, was working on foreign policy, battling the USSR in some of the closest moments we got to a full-on hot war instead of a cold war. So, as I said, Kennedy's years in office oftentimes compare it to Camelot. Now, some of the foreign policy goals that he came up with were sort of goodwill plans, almost think of like the Marshall Plan again. Early in his administration, he established the Peace Corps with the goal of, like, let's send young Americans overseas to sort of help developing countries and educate them and, plant crops, plant trees, dig water wells, things like that. By 1966, over 15,000 people had signed up to do this, not partially because by 1966, this was an alternative to going to Vietnam. Now, we also see that after the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin into space, Gagarin is the first human to go to space in 1961, and they brought him down safely. JFK announced America would make it to the moon by 1970, and NASA kind of said, what? They had not been sort of informed of this. And many people thought it was impossible, but we actually made it by 1969 due to his commitment. So, here at Kennedy with the Peace Corps volunteers. My dad is not pictured here, but my dad did go to Ghana with the Peace Corps. This was his alternative to Vietnam. Here's Yuri Gagarin, who said, "Orbiting Earth in the spaceship, I saw how beautiful our planet is. People, let us preserve and increase this beauty, not destroy it." And lastly, here is our own Yuri Gagarin, Neil Armstrong, standing on the surface of the moon. And you can actually see Buzz Aldrin in the reflection taking that selfie. So, Kennedy had more issues in Latin America, less goodwill. He tried to sort of do a goodwill thing in 1961 with the Alliance for Progress, where he tried to build up these developing Latin American countries, partially to kind of see America as a goodwill kind of person, a group of people who are willing to, help them out to develop their nations, and partially as a way of saying, you see how much better we are than the communists? Unfortunately, we were giving money to a lot of local dictators who basically held on to the money themselves, and the plan sort of flopped. He also had to deal with a communist revolt in 1959 in Cuba. Fidel Castro, the communist leader of Cuba, took over from Fulgencio Batista, who was closely associated with the United States. And now Fidel Castro was taking formerly American-held territory away from American companies and giving it to the Cuban people. This very deeply worried the United States about what his goals were and what he was going to do. Now, it is important to realize that Fidel Castro is not a nice guy. He was a dictator, a brutal dictator, and so that is important to realize as well. But he was also a communist dictator, and so he was the sort we did not care for. So here's Fidel Castro, who said, "A revolution is not a trail of roses. A revolution is a fight to the death between the future and the past." So he also started to get closer and closer to the USSR, and America took action at this point. Eisenhower suspended relations with Cuba, and under Kennedy, the CIA started to recruit and train Cuban refugees to actually invade Cuba. This was actually an Eisenhower plan that Kennedy sort of was saddled with after Eisenhower left office. We thought if we trained up a bunch of Cuban refugees who had made it to America, and Cuban exiles, if we trained them up, gave them guns and planes, that they could go and attack Cuba and remove Castro in one swift invasion. This was called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was a monumental disaster. It was such an open secret that people thought it was misinformation. Of the 1,400 invaders, most of them were captured, several were killed, and many of them were stuck in Cuba in prison for about 10 months. Excuse me. This drove Castro closer to the USSR, and the CIA started to try more and more outlandish ways to assassinate the Cuban dictator, including things like explosive cigars and poisoned ice cream and things like that. So here are some of the invaders from the Bay of Pigs. Most of them spent about 20 months in prison before being traded for millions of dollars in food and medicine to the United States. This is also why we have a strongly anti-communist Cuban ethnic enclave, especially in South Florida, who do not like communist Cuba up through today. Now, things were getting worse, especially between Cuba, the U.S., and the USSR. The relations were falling apart. In August 1961, while so many German citizens of East Germany were fleeing to West Berlin, the USSR basically built a wall around West Berlin to stop people from getting in. They said it was to stop, West Germans from secretly trying to get into East Germany, but the truth was that they were losing all their best and brightest to the West. And that wall stayed up until 1989, when East Germany was on the verge of collapse, and the people of Berlin actually rose up to knock it down by themselves. This will be probably the last thing we see this year in this semester. So this is the circumference of the Berlin Wall, and the biggest entry point, Checkpoint Charlie. That is the crossing point between East and West Berlin. And here's what it looks like, a section of it that used to run. And that was the no man's land in between. You do not go over the fence, or you will be shot and killed. Now, some of the most dangerous days of the Cold War took place in October of '62. That's when an American spy plane photographed Russian missiles being installed in Cuba. And after we took a look at them, we realized that these missiles were nuclear. So the Russians were putting nuclear missiles into Cuba. JFK's military advisors very strongly suggested that we invade Cuba, that we then move to protect Berlin when the Russians attack Berlin, and destroy the USSR using nuclear weapons in order to get rid of them. And that would mean that they would fire theirs, mutually assured destruction. That would be World War III right there. And so Kennedy luckily thought that there were other ways of going about this. But here is the missiles in Cuba, and you can see that they did pose a real threat to the United States. As far west as Denver, certainly able to hit St. Louis, which is the important part. Now, instead of invading Cuba, Kennedy decided to stop any further missiles from entering using a blockade, basically setting up a bunch of ships around it, around the island, to stop any more Russian ships from getting in. Now, the problem is that the word blockade is an act of war, so he called it a quarantine instead, and this stopped the USSR from adding more missiles. It gave the two nations time for some very tense negotiations, and for 13 days, we were about as close to full-on nuclear war as we've ever been. And in the end, Khrushchev decided to remove the missiles from Cuba, and we had sort of made a backroom deal, a silent deal, that if he got rid of the missiles in Cuba, we would get rid of our own missiles in Turkey, and we promised not to invade Cuba. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, said we were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked. And I tend to believe that both of us kind of blinked, and I'm okay with that fact because it means that we didn't get involved in an all-out nuclear war. And so, like I said, here's the blockade of Cuba going on, the quarantine. I'm sorry, with you can see U.S. naval ships and troops, and we got very close to World War III those days in October of '62. Now, at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we eased tensions a little bit between our countries. We also installed, one of the issues was that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it took about 12 hours to get a message from the US to the USSR and then back. So instead of waiting that long, we decided it would be important to install a hotline, a phone that, it sat on the president's desk and he could basically pick it up and get in touch with the Russian premier immediately instead. Kennedy even was talking about nuclear de-escalation and possibly opening some sort of rapprochement with Castro and Cuba. Unfortunately, he would not live to see either. And on November 22nd, 1963, JFK was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became president after this. So here's JFK just moments before his assassination in Dallas. Here's Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office on Air Force One, standing next to JFK's widow. She's still wearing the clothes that she was wearing in that car. And here is our 36th president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. 1963 to 1969 were the years of his presidency. He was from Texas. He was a former congressman, former senator, former vice president, and among many other things, including his very salty language at times, he was rather well known for having meetings while on the toilet. And so he was a very interesting guy. Nowadays, mostly he's thought of as the Vietnam president, but as we'll see, there was a lot more to him as well. So let's look at Johnson's presidency. Kennedy had been born into wealth and privilege. Johnson had been born into a very poor area of Texas. He had worked his way up through the House of Representatives. He had been a congressman siding with FDR during the New Deal. He briefly fought in World War II. He became a Senate Majority Leader and finally Vice President. So while Kennedy was kind of the new kid, Johnson had been around for decades. Now, along with the New Deal, Johnson was also a pretty firm advocate for the poor and underserved. And as we saw with the Civil Rights Bill of '64, he was an advocate eventually for African Americans as well. The Civil Rights Bill was Kennedy's idea, but Johnson was the one who got it passed. He also got the Voting Rights Act passed in '65. He was a great deal maker. This was what he was best known for. He was, while Kennedy had trouble getting stuff passed, Johnson was really good at getting stuff passed. It was he knew how to threaten people. He knew how to flatter people. He knew how to just tower over people. He was a tall guy too, and he often used what they called the Johnson treatment, where he would just basically lean over people and sort of force them to do what he wanted them to do. So here's Johnson giving the Johnson treatment. This guy's literally like backing into the table behind him. Now in 1964, he ran for re-election, having only been president for a little over a year. With the short-term backing of the Civil Rights Movement, as we're going to see, Johnson and the Civil Rights Movement eventually kind of break up. Johnson had a landslide victory against the Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is billed by many as the first modern conservative in the modern style. And so we're going to see that even though he lost in '64, Goldwater is going to have a massive impact on the modern conservative movement. Goldwater was he was very strongly anti-communist. He was for stronger stances on Russia, but he also was against liberalism at home. He thought that government-funded Social Security and social welfare should be given to private charities. He was worried about the size of the federal government. He wanted to get rid of the graduated income tax, believing that it was basically taxing rich people. He also voted against the Civil Rights Act of '64. And he eventually was painted as sort of dangerous both at home and abroad by Johnson. And so Johnson beat Goldwater by nearly twice as many votes as Goldwater got nationally. And so here's Barry Goldwater, 1909 to 1998, from Arizona. He was an Air Force major. He was a soldier, a businessman, and a senator from Arizona. Like I said, many believe that he was the first sort of modern conservative. And also, he was a very close friend to both Kennedy and Johnson, even though he did not agree with them politically. He was good friends with both socially. So, for instance, he was a famous photographer, and this is a signed, autographed photograph that John F. Kennedy gave to Barry Goldwater. He said, "For Barry Goldwater, whom I urge to follow the career with which he has shown much talent, photography," from his friend John F. Kennedy, basically saying, go photograph stuff, stop being a senator. Barry Goldwater once said, "I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." So this was the final tally for the 1964 presidential election, and as you see, he got his home state of Arizona, and he also got the Deep South. That's going to be something that's going to be important later on. So, in 1964, Democrats swept. They got the House, the Senate, and the White House. However, it was also the beginning of modern conservatism, and we'll see that come back in a big way in 1968. Now, Goldwater's anti-civil rights stances did very well in the Deep South. We also see that George Wallace of Alabama, who was the governor of Alabama, ran as a third-party independent candidate, and he did very well in some northern states by going against government interference. And so this led to a lot of people saying, this may have been a Democratic liberal victory, but conservatism seems to be on the rise as well. Meanwhile, in California, we also saw that there were some movements to overturn a state law banning racial discrimination in real estate, saying it was the freedom of homeowners to decide what the suburbs would look like. Now, while the 60s is generally thought of to be the countercultural sort of liberal hippie movement, and we will get to that part, there was also a strong conservative movement at that time that is often overlooked. Both sides had their young voters on their sides. Just as liberal groups had, the Students for a Democratic Society and the Yippies and things like that, conservative youth groups such as the Young Americans for Freedom released statements calling for increased personal freedom, more free market economy, a very small federal government, and, of course, the destruction of communism as our international foreign policy stance. Now, the Young Americans for Freedom were the ones that brought Barry Goldwater to the forefront in 1964 instead of a more moderate Republican. The conservative movement also found some constituents in the growing suburbs of this time, in the upper middle class and middle class of this time, particularly in growing suburbs like Orange County, California, which sort of became a conservative haven up through the modern times. So Goldwater's wins in southern states also show that there were conservative voters in the anti-civil rights Deep South. This became known as the Southern strategy to sort of ignite the deep Southern anti-civil rights faction to vote for the Republicans. Nixon would use this very successfully to win the White House in 1968, along with several other strategies he had. Now, along with civil rights and other reforms under Johnson, he also worked on immigration reform with the Hart-Keller Act. He stopped the quota system that said we would only accept a few immigrants from places like Asia and East Europe. Now, these new standards tried as best they could to be more race neutral, focusing on reuniting families and focusing less on what your ethnicity was and more what skills you brought to the table. However, this was also a time of growing fear of illegal immigration from Latin America. In fact, this is where the term illegal immigrant comes from. We do see that the amount of legal immigrants from places like Mexico, Southern, Central America went down during this time. So here's Johnson signing the Hart-Keller Act, and not pictured it, but a great, sort of example of a symbolic gesture is he's signing it basically on Liberty Island with the Statue of Liberty right next to him. And I believe on his right there, that's Bobby Kennedy. And on his left, I can't tell by the side view, but that might be his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. All three of these guys are going to become very important in 1968. So, after winning in 64, Johnson also promoted what he called the Great Society. This was his goal for the national government of America. He wanted to increase government welfare projects, the biggest since the New Deal. He introduced Medicare and Medicaid to make sure the elderly and the poor could receive some form of medical care. He created the Department of Transportation and also the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Oftentimes, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is seen as sort of like focusing on urban cities and urban planning, and oftentimes that is also associated with African Americans, fairly or unfairly. He also created new offices like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Endowment for the Arts and for the Humanities, and the Public Broadcasting System as well. So he was sort of, definitely, he was one who was for expanding the power of the federal government. And a quote from him is, "The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and enlarge his talents. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods." Now, this was not in response to a depression. In effect, this was in response to a booming economy and him saying, like, okay, let's use this economy. Johnson and other liberal Democrats believed that an expanding economy meant that we could help more people, basically. Now, the centerpiece of this was what he called the War on Poverty. Between 40 and 50 million Americans were still below the poverty line, even though, when we think of the 50s and 60s, we think of a very wealthy time period. Most were in rural America, in Appalachia, and also in the inner cities where white flight had just left poor African Americans instead, financially poor. Now, while many of these poor people were white, the desire to help the poor also is very closely linked to the civil rights movement. We'll see that when King marched, he was often marching in response to poverty. Efforts included creating food stamps, which is food assistance for poor families, early childhood education, job training, and scholarships. He also created what was called VISTA, which is you could sign up to almost do like a Peace Corps in the inner cities of America instead of in Ghana. You could go and sort of work in the inner cities to try to help build up poor people in this area. Now, Johnson's war on poverty also borrowed from his own political history. He actually used the term freedom from want that hadn't been heard since FDR's New Deal. He also was talking about civil rights as well. He said that black poverty was at least partially due to, according to him, past injustice and present prejudice. So he is definitely, trying to attack poverty from all sides. He's not saying it's just an issue of, like, I don't know, laziness or something like that, that there are deep-seated issues that are the reasons behind poverty. He also associated economic liberty and freedom with the equality of opportunity during this time. And he did do a lot, and we do see that he was at least somewhat successful, or something was somewhat successful during this time. The poverty rate in America dropped from 22 to 13% during the Johnson era. However, it is still an issue faced by many people up through modern times. So this is, if any other president was president during this time, this might be what he's remembered for, but we are going to see Johnson does become the Vietnam War president after the war in Vietnam breaks out during his watch.